Welcome to Field Notes. Today we're talking about integrating annual slash alternative forages in Wisconsin. Michael, why are we talking about this? What's the big deal here?
Yeah, I think this is something that came up a lot last year, maybe with the drought. Maybe this year's a little bit different, and we'll talk about that during the episode. But I think the key word that I like to think about when I think about like warm season annual forages, like we're going to be chatting about here, is adaptability and kind of that opportunity to add something into the rotation or in a certain year that can kind of help you pivot and manage your forage inventory. And thankfully, I'm not going to be the expert on the call today talking about everything because we have Yoana Newman from UW River Falls and faculty extension specialist with UW-Madison Extension, and Matt Oehmican, one of the Oehmicans at Short Lane Ag Supply in central Wisconsin, here to chat with us. So, Yoana, Matt, thanks for joining us. We're glad to have you on to chat about this topic. And we might actually just get things started here with Matt today. So, we know like dairy and livestock producers in Wisconsin are always looking for those adaptive ways to produce forage for feed, especially during like abnormal weather years, like drought years. How are warm season annual forages an opportunity for Wisconsin farms, Matt?
So to answer your question, I like it when you use that word adaptability, and I usually like to refer to flexibility as well. And when I use that word flexibility, you can really take advantage of delayed planting scenarios. So let's say if that new seeding or that silage um, opportunity wasn't present there due to weather conditions or field conditions, you have a wide range of different species that you can plug and play and even combine and work that into these delayed planting scenarios like we're witnessing now. And a lot of these species can cover a lot of different conditions, whether it's like drought, heavy rain, but that's something that is a really helpful arsenal to have, especially when you're working with growers trying to uh, maintain forage opportunities.
Great. And Joanna, what are the types of when we talk about summer annual forages, what are we talking about as far as species here for Wisconsin?
All right. Thanks, Will and Michael, for the opportunity to be here. To answer your question, here in Wisconsin, we can grow summer annuals like the sorghums. They tend to grow more during the hottest month of the summer, and they have forage sorghum, Sudan grass, sorghum Sudan hybrid. And additionally, on that group, where we have the species that are adapted to the very hot conditions, we have things like pearl millet that, while it's not in the sorghum family, it is very drought tolerant. So we have other species that can be used in that summer, using Matt's term, for flexibility, we have things, like teff. Or things like crabgrass, but those will have a little bit more moisture requirement. So if we're strictly talking alternatives for more of the very drought, hot weather like we had last summer, we're dealing with the sorghums, sorghum Sudan hybrids, and pearl millet. They're excellent options that will provide that flexibility in use.
Great. Thanks, Joanna. And then Matt, when you're working with farmers out at Short Lane, we just talked about a bunch of different species. I don't know how many of them you work with, but what does that decision-making process look like when you're working with farmers or planning it yourself, as far as, what species to choose, what blend to choose? Are you thinking about a certain farm or certain species of livestock that they're trying to feed?
Oh, certainly. I would say that the first question is who who are you feeding this to? Is this going to be driven for milk production, or is this feeding some heifers, or are you just taking care of some beefers? And then the second question is, what is the field condition and field history of these acres that it's going on? Meaning, is this going to be well drained? Is it dry? Is it heavy? Is it saturated, wet? And what time are you thinking you can get in there? And then the other when I say get in there, like for planting wise, you don't want to really tell somebody like getting into like that July time frame of like, well, let's go with a forage sorghum that's going to be like 100 and some days until it gets to that dough stage, right? Or it's going to take it like 90 days to get to boot stage. You really don't want to push that envelope. But yeah, the first conversation is like, what kind of quality of feed do we want? Do you want tonnage? Do you want high digestibility? And then what are our environmental conditions going into? So she talked about pearl millet, well-drained ground. Pearl millet, of all the millets, if you were going to pick one, pearl millet is like your top tier one, right? That one's going to be an excellent quality. But if you're going to go into like some heavy ground, like you see in north central Wisconsin, around like Colby, Clark County, Marathon County, that pearl millet can only go in so many places and work really well. And that's why we kind of lean towards Japanese millet if somebody's asking for millet specifically, because Japanese millet it eats up the slop, loves that wet condition. So that one is something that we would default to. So you don't want to necessarily just give a blank recommendation without first really doing your homework of what environmental conditions you're getting into. And another one is like expectation. So if somebody's like, hey, listen, if I can cut it for forage or if I can get my animals to graze on it, that's great. But if it could just sit out there, that's fine too. Well, then we'll kind of lean towards like a really basic, no nonsense mix where it's like small grains, brassicas, and some annual clovers, where it's just like, hey, this doesn't look that bad. I'm going to cut this. If, dry matter ton yield wise, we'll see like maybe 1.5, maybe up to 4 ton, how long you want it to go for. Feedability is fairly decent when it's heavy brassica, but you know what I mean? You can adapt those mixes to whatever kind of goal or needs that farmer is looking for.
Great. And I think this is a question for both of you. So one of you can kind of just jump in. When I think of the summer annual forages, like it's either, I feel like it often tumbles down to it's either a millet or sorghum Sudan grass is kind of like your big grass species. And then you can throw in some other things into that mix. I'm wondering like, what is the thought process behind choosing one or the other? Or maybe, you do both, but like what does a millet have over sorghum Sudan grass and vice versa?
The first thing would be, where you're at. You could be Northwest, or you could be in central South Wisconsin. And then the difference between these areas is that you have a 2-week, basically, it boils down to, there's a 2-week difference. So probably our summer would be limited, in Northwest, as opposed to central South. Then comes to, as mentioned earlier, the type of soil you have. What to choose, what species. There's some of them like brassicas, they require, they're more adapted to a little bit cooler weather. So you either plant it really early in the say late spring, early summer, if they're more like a late spring, or they're gonna come later in the summertime for planting. And then you have, like the in-between, like the hardcore summer, that's going to be your sorghum Sudan. Depending on the use, you will have things, brown midrib, they're going to be less lignin, more geared toward dairy situation, higher nutritional requirement animals, whether that's dairy or beef if you're finishing. Then it comes to the type of soils. If you have basic soils, these sorghums, in general, they'll do very well, but they don't like wet feet. If you have things, that are more, if you're into a more clay type, then that's where the choosing of, your forage sorghum or some other species, come into play.
Great. Matt, do you have anything to follow up with that on?
I'll take a different kind of spin. And somebody could say like, well, that seems really simple, Matt. A lot of times it just comes down to what's your access for equipment and what kind of time do you have with it. And a lot of times I will lean on what the farmer or grower has had experience working with, because when it's crunch time like this, there also has to be an element of user friendliness, if that can be a correct term. So if they've used millets before or sorghums before, then you want to kind of ease into that more. But generally speaking, if we're going to be focusing on that question you posed, I see millets a lot of time being intermingled in cocktail mixes or in grazing mixes, or somebody that has has a well-established chopping system. Whereas sorghums are most popular for guys and gals that have like the corn silage setup, where they're like, hey, I like the idea of just like 2-cut system. Well, okay, well, let's do that sorghum sedan grass. Or listen, I just want to do like a 1-cut system, lob that stuff down, and away I go. And I want to have similar tonnage that I see with corn silage. Well, then we're going to lean on those forage sorghums, right? And we also don't want to miss out on like some of the other goody goods that come with summer annual forages. So like Italian ryegrass, that was really, really hot and popular, especially a couple of years ago, and it still remains an option. And it was kind of competing against perennial systems for a while. But that poses like a multiple cut system where you get really good tonnage and excellent feed quality, and you get really good opportunity to have that grazing scheme, right? But I would say that a lot of times it comes down to like what's a similar setup that people are used to. So to reiterate once again, like if somebody's used to the corn silage cutting scheme, then almost every time sorghum sedan or forage sorghum becomes the key issue, or a key issue, the key species to use.
If I may add, totally agree with Matt there. Whatever the farmer has or rancher has, in terms of equipment or accessibility to equipment, is going to dictate what he can do. Maybe, we have a very wet year like this one, and they're all kind of piggybacking into, hey, can we use this equipment? Can we borrow? Especially if they're thinking of making baleage now, because it's been hard to find kind of like that window of 3 to 4 days of clear weather. But you may think about, okay, this is, maybe ideally for doing some baleage, but you may not have a wrapper to do the wrapping after you cut your bales. So basically, the decision making, is the adaptation of the species when you're looking at what to choose from, but the farmer rancher, it's key as to what are his needs in terms of animals and in terms of equipment that he has, or how intense, we have some guys that are really, cutting edge on things, and we have some others that, excellent in their work, but that's not what they want. They may not be interested in doing a multi-cutting, but maybe having some more cover crop ground cover. So any of these, could be a good alternative for that, keeping the ground, covered there.
Yeah, definitely. And that transitions pretty well into our next conversation, which is around the management piece. And so we know the management of these different species will probably play a factor into which one a farmer will choose to grow on their farm. So let's just say, like, once someone's made that decision to grow one of these species that we've been talking about, there's definitely some unique management considerations, maybe compared to growing any of the other kinds of forages that we have in Wisconsin for like cool seasons, for example. So maybe let's talk about a few of those. And so, Joanna, you've kind of mentioned it a little bit, but would you want to talk a little bit more about when these species would usually be planted for Wisconsin?
Right, certainly. So if we're talking about the sorghums, right? They're like mentioned, they evolve in that semi-arid areas. Their centers of origin go back to Africa, the areas that are in tropical areas there. So for management of these, we have the single cutting that we can use for fermentation, whether silage or baleage. We can use forage types that they have that larger stem that we talk about, with limited, regrowth, or the ratooning, as it's called, after maturity. The single cuts options could be brown meat rib, which is a reduced lignin. Those, tend to have like the brown meat rib in them. And that's an indication of higher digestibility, or the reduced lignin that provides that higher digestibility. They can be used as a single cutting maybe 2 to 6 weeks after heading for increased yield and quality. The dry matter there would range from 5 to 9 tons per acre. And then the cutting or chopping should be to a low stubble. As you know, you want to get as much of the yield. And driving in the field should be slow, so the cutting is consistent. Otherwise, if you're not careful, then you're going to be leaving uneven stubble height in the field. If using this manner, chop length should be 1 1/4 inch. Then we have the multiple cutting options that include the Sudan grass, remember the thinner stem, or the sorghum Sudan hybrids. These have the ability to ratoon or grow from tillers after the first cut, as long as we don't let it complete their maturity or head out. Once they're head out, totally, it's kind of game over. If we're talking northwest, where we are this far north, we may have 1 or 2 cuttings depending on planting date. So if you plant earlier, you're going to have more cuttings. If planted in June, maybe 2, 3 harvests. And then if planted in July, early, possibly one cutting, maybe 2, depending on when your first freeze will come. Multiple cutting will provide higher quality and yield. Higher quality because you're harvesting mostly for vegetative and more younger, less mature material. And then the dry matter yield seasonal would be or would range between 5 to 9 tons per acre. If doing a first cutting or use, grazing needs to be at 40 inches or 40 days after planting, just because these sorghums, they tend to have high cyanides, or what leads to prussic acid. Second cuttings and later cuttings should be done at about every 4 weeks, and to an 18-inch regrowth, which that could be your signal for grazing. In the case of pear millet, it has plenty of tillering. As we talked earlier, millet, great quality, but millet is less consistent into what you're getting. And we see that same seed, same quality, same practices, same conditions, and sometimes it's not as reliable into what you're getting. So that's something to consider there. Pear millet can be rotationally grazed every 2 to 4 weeks, leaving about a 6 to 8 inch stubble height. And unlike the sorghums or sorghum hybrids, pear millet does not cause prussic acid poisoning and is safe. In the case, we're talking mostly beef and dairy, but if you have horses, this is one alternative that you can use. Horses, you cannot use sorghums, but pear millet doesn't have that issue with them. Dry matter yield for pear millet is ranges from 4 to 6 tons per acre.
Thank you so much, Yoana. A lot on that management piece. And Matt, I kind of want to push it to you now and to talk about the quality management piece. Like, how does this fit into like our rotation as far as feeding for dairy cattle? What's the nutrition there? How do we manage it agronomically? Like Yoana was talking about the cuts and the quality, and then how does that translate kind of to the feeding aspect of it?
A lot of these guys and gals on the dairy side of things will have these nutritionists that will dial right in, and the feedback that I get is when it comes to like the sorghums, your BMR 6s, and that's really key to understand, because you can have some sorghum Sudan and BMRs or sorghum BMR that are advertised, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's like a quality brown midrib. So one of the things that we always focus on is like if it's a BMR 6, especially on the sorghum Sudan grass side of things, so that nothing is missed out. But when it comes to stuff that has like that higher carbon content, you really don't see a lot of places having to really adjust their rations. I know that it becomes a little bit trickier when you start working with like the more exotic mixes, where like it's a whole plethora of like annual clovers and brassicas, especially because there's just not a lot of fiber to it, right? So then you got to supplement it quite a bit. When it comes to that nutritional side of things, I always lean that responsibility on the farmer because they know their animals far better than I do. But I know that there's less headaches when you're working with something that has really good digestibility, like your Italian ryegrasses, a pearl millet, not necessarily like a Japanese or definitely not a Prusso millet. And then also with your sorghum Sudan grasses, that there's less with that. One thing I would like to talk about when you talk about quality side of things, the one common element is nobody focuses on the fertility aspect. When everybody goes with these summer annuals, they do great in low pH, they do great in low fertility, but then they always will say the same thing, like that second cutting wasn't as good, or when I got to that third cutting, it was just skimpy. Like we're talking Italian ryegrasses, well, because there's no fertilizing. And it also goes like into peas and oats. People will be like, I don't know why, Matt, you told me to do these peas and oats. Like, I don't think it was that great. I'm like, well, what did you do for like fertility out there? Well, I didn't put anything out there. You know what I mean? A lot of these, when it's forages, you got to remember that those plants have to build tissue. They have to build tissue. They got to have good cell structure, and they need a lot of energy to get to that height and to get to that quality. And if you skimp out on the fertility management side of things, then you're leaving quality out on the field, right? And you're not getting 100% value. And I'm not advocating that you got to dump truck a bunch of fertilizer out there, but I think it's appropriate to keep in mind, if you're especially working with sorghum Sudan grass, watch what the nitrogen and sulfur rates are going to be, that you want to have that applied out there, especially after that first cutting, so that regeneration and that rebound of those plants is a little bit easier to develop that regrowth, and to keep track of your potassium levels. That is so common in hay systems and silage systems. Potassium levels tank, and everybody wonders why they get sickly looking grass over time, or they have like some yield drops, because nobody focuses on the potassium levels, because potassium drives cellular structure and tissue development. So that equates to yield and quality, right? Leaf development, standability, everything. So that would be the other thing. And Snap Plus, I know some people will grumble about Snap Plus, but they give really good they give good, when I say good numbers, it gives you something to think about if you wanted to hit this kind of yield mark, these are the kind of volumes of like for urea, AMS, potash that you should consider if you want to maintain your fertility, or if you want to hit yield marks. And that was something else that I learned from this guy, Jason Cavadini, when he was doing his Italian ryegrass studies, where you saw a positive impact when there was timely, whether it was dry or liquid, nitrogen applications. But even there, when it was third or fourth application, he was noticing that there was differences in the fertilizer uptake. So that's something where if somebody really wanted to explore more, Jason had a great study on that, showing nitrogen uptake and yield wise when it came with Italian ryegrass, where he showed if we didn't fertilize it, we didn't get as good a yield or quality, but there also was a fine line that it was over fertilized too. And I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that aspect of the potassium and those other macronutrients, not just nitrogen, being important to growth and to, replacement, because that's the other part of that is when you're dealing in forages, you're taking the whole plant off the field. It's not recycling those nutrients back into the soil. And so you got to replace everything that you're pulling out at least in order to keep on having that plant grow.
Well, it's a simple concept. If I went out to the woods right now and I clear cut the whole entire thing, why does stuff grow back in the spring then? Like in a couple of years, you'll see popples, you'll see brush, you'll see grass, everything just comes right back up. And it's not like I told the county to go dump truck potash out there in my clear cut. It's because there's a nutrient cycling system where that ground is already nutrient dense. Stuff grows, it falls down, decays, gets processed, gets brought back up again. We're in a forage system. We have the nutrients in the ground. Plant takes up nutrients. We remove all the tissue, but then there's not enough to replenish back. And you could say like, well, hey, listen, I'm putting dairy manure out there. I'm finishing up the cycle. But most times it's not enough, right? You got to have this balance of like immediate nutrient application, residue on the top part of the soil where you can have long-term nutrient release, and also having that residue covered to kind of manage everything from soil temp. And like you said, they have like that balance between macro and micronutrients.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Matt.
Sorry, I nerded out right there. I always get excited talking about like that nutrient cycle stuff.
No, I think it's awesome. And the potassium thing is huge. It's something that I see a lot with the grazers that I work with, even. It's just the often neglected nutrient.
And it's completely misdiagnosed. The only reason I caught wind of this is this fella had grass that was yellowing, and then it had this discoloration on the leaf that when you identified it, it looked like a disease. But everybody kept screaming at me like, just put nitrogen on it. It's nitrogen deficient. Just put nitrogen on it. It's like, well, so then you pull a soil test. Well, potassium parts per million was below 30. So then you dig in a little bit more of like what potassium does for a plant. And you're like, we got weak tissue, more prone to disease. Why don't we put some potash out there? And I even did that to a guy last year on the west side of the state in the drought where the field was yellow and looked terrible. And I said, try putting potash out there. And everybody laughed. They're like, Matt, it's yellow because it's dry. And I'm like, just try it. And I'm not even kidding. It started to green up. Granted, a rainfall came, but they said that hay field did better where they put the potash versus the fields where they didn't put that potash, because they were as curious as I was. So there's something definitely to it. Everything always has a story. You just got to figure. It's just trying to figure out what chapter to turn to first.
Well, that's agronomy. So. Cool. Well, yeah, definitely appreciate the conversation on management with both of you. We did want to kind of wrap things up here, talking about sort of the integration of these. And I know we've talked about it throughout, but maybe to just make it a little bit more explicit for people that might be listening. So like, are these, warm season annual forages, like we're talking about, are they only a best fit on years like when we have abnormally dry conditions or forage inventories are low? Or is there some merit to including these forages in a regular rotation? And maybe kind of adding some more food for thought there. How would they fit in a year like we've had so far this summer that's been particularly wet? And maybe Yoana, if you want to take the lead on that one, go ahead.
Well, and these summer annuals, they're basically in my view, like an insurance. The more diversity that you have, the more flexibility that you have. You can play with the different species. Right now we have an excess of rain, but we don't know when this rain's gonna stop, and then we may hit a kind of like a pause, where we have maybe like a short drought. Then you have some resources that can help. Whether they're, what I call the true tropicals, the sorghums, pear millets, or whether we have some of the other species, they'll give you some flexibility. They may allow you to rest your cool seasons that tend to be very low yielding during these summer times. And then by having some of these, you can extend the grazing season. When you add some of the, we haven't talked so much about the legumes, but when you have legumes, could be cool seasons that you can add. Berseem clover, more clay, wet soils. It's not cold tolerant, even though it's a cool season, so it will extend the production season for you. So yeah, I see them more as a, as an insurance due to the flexibility they bring. As cover crops, some of them tend to produce earlier into the summer. Some of them tend to produce later in the summer, early fall, like the brassicas. And you have some nutrition in them. The true tropical summer species, they're second behind corn, but they will provide high protein, like the sorghums. Maybe a couple, they're not energy feeds, but in the case of sorghums, highly palatable, and they bring that possibly 1 or 2 percentage points on protein. So maybe 9%, 10%, 11% protein. The key issue here, especially if you are in an irrigated system, they will bring a lot of savings because they're very water use efficient. If nothing else, you're saving into your watering bills. Yeah, it provides that flexibility, opportunity to spread your risk, while you wait for the backbone of our industry, the cool season grasses and legumes.
Great, thanks. Matt, you have any thoughts about integration or some last parting tidbits?
How much time do you have? Oh man. So I wrote a few things down, and this is the order I wrote them in. When it comes to integration and what I see most common when people are talking about these, train wreck weather, that's primary drive number one. Small grains, and I'll explain that here in a second, and cost of production. So train wreck weather, that's self-explanatory, right? I had it where in the Sparta region, I shout out to Gavin. He did a sorghum and a berseem clover blend, and in the drought, it hardly came up, and it didn't work out. But he took a brassica blend that he was going to use as like to prime the field to get ready for a new seeding, and that's what he ended up grazing his animals on the most, because he was able to get like multiple grazings off of it. And I saw that at Jason Cavadini's when he did a pasture recovery mix that had a little bit of brassica and oats and Italian ryegrass, and he got 4 grazings off of it. So you can have these species and these blends that can adapt quickly to the weather, but it's at the end of the day, that's the reason that people bring this up. Now, small grains, this is where I talk about integration. You can't beat the way that people can integrate these summer annuals, or even just like a cheater's way to get an alternative forage with winter cereals. So like winter wheat or rye, you have them plant that following soybeans or corn silage, and then you can plant it at a thick rate, and then put a little bit of nitrogen on in the spring, and then you can get yourself a really good cutting. So one fella told me that his RFQ was above 190, and then he had protein levels at 20%. But that was after they did a dribble bar application when it was about like 2 feet tall, of like 15 gallons of 28% to feed it along a little bit. But then you cut that. So then the next question somebody brings up, like, well, what do I plant here now? And you can either integrate that into like, well, let's do late planted corn silage or early planted corn silage. Or, you know what? Do you want to do another summer annual mix to help set that up? You know what I mean? And then let's go back to small grains. Let's say if they do like a forage oat, like a forage oat plus Laker oats, you do a cutting of that, same thing. All of a sudden you have this blank canvas and a lot of time to seed multiple things. And then the grower is kind of tickled pink because all of a sudden you have this opportunity of double cropping. And that goes into this cost of production model. And that was a conversation I had with a grower too, is, you can afford to take a little bit of a yield hit as long as you're doing 2 harvests in one season, right? Because you're double cropping, especially in northern central Wisconsin. That's not easy to do, and it's really advantageous. And then also, if you look at some of these alternative forages like sorghum, you're looking at like anywhere between like maybe $55 to all the way up to like $89 per bag, depending on what variety you get. And you're covering a few acres per bag, and you're getting similar yields to corn silage. where you're paying a bag that's like $300 to $350, you know, all of a sudden that makes a lot of sense. And then also cost of production, if people are looking at their marginal acres and they're not ready to commit to a perennial system like a pollinator or vegetative strip, or maybe like a grass hay mix, those are great ways to integrate these alternative forages or these summer annuals of like, hey, let's put this out here right now. Let it do its thing. If you can harvest it, great. If we let it go full, that's fine too. And that gives them time to plot out what they want to do in those marginal acres that will ding their overall yield average on the whole field, which that kind of dings the checkbook as well, if that makes sense.
Totally. Thanks, folks, for sharing your thoughts with us today and coming and talking with us. We really appreciate it.
This was a lot of fun, and I'm kind of curious, why are you talking in a box? Well, I'm talking in a warehouse too, so we're all out of our element, I guess.
Right. So here, this is what it sounds like with the box, right? And then I'm going to take apart the box, and you can hear the difference. So.
I see.
You see how much louder it is and more echoey?
And we got to think out of the box.
Yeah. Take apart the box. It's a whole thing. It's representative of the larger thinking of summer annuals, right? You got to think outside the box. Will destroys the box at the end.
Oh man. That was a mind pretzel right there.
Yeah, it's Tuesday morning. Well, stop.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Time to turn your brain into a pretzel.
Thanks for listening. This has been Field Notes from UW-Madison Extension. My name is Will Fulwider, Regional Crops Educator for Dane and Dodge counties. And I was joined by my co-host Michael Geissinger, Outreach Specialist in Northwest Wisconsin for the Nutrient and Pest Management Program of UW-Madison. A big thank you to Joe Ryan for creating our theme music and to Abby Wilkie-Maki for our logo. If you have any questions about anything you've heard today or about your farming practices in general, reach out to the Extension Agriculture Educators serving your region.